Thanks for joining us today. I'm for Jennifer Schaus and Associates in our Webinar Wednesday program, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. We are uncovering each part of the DFARS, or Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern. As you know, the DFARS are the rulebooks for contracting with the Defense Department, and we have been moving sequentially, so we started with DFARS Part 201 in January, and we will be finishing with Part 253 in December. Our webinars are every Wednesday and are provided complimentary. They are recorded and can be downloaded from our website and YouTube channel, which now holds over 450 of our government contracting webinars. In the interest of time, we do not take questions, so if you do have questions for our speaker, we will have his information on the last slide of the presentation today. Virginia PSAC at GMU offers free one-on-one counseling to firms in Virginia on federal, state, and local procurement topics. Online resources and group trainings are free with no restriction on business location. If you are interested in learning more, please use the links provided to explore what PSAC can offer. Set-Aside Alert provides up-to-date news, information, and opportunities for small business federal contractors. Their daily opportunities alerts assure you won't miss important sources sought and solicitation announcements, providing details so you can jump on the hot ones. Every 2 weeks, they deliver concise breaking news, events, regulations, and teaming opportunities. Please join the Reston Chamber of Commerce Government Contractors Council for regular meetings. Please contact Alicia Fields with the email shown on your screen if you do have any questions. Federal contracting is a relationship game. Now get in front of your federal humans sooner with the exclusive Players and Layers method from Judy Bratt and Summit Insight. Connect with her on LinkedIn and find out more, or visit GrowFedbizcom today. And if you're interested in selling to the federal government, you may need a contract vehicle. The most popular one is the GSA Schedule. Learn more about the requirements, the proposal process, and how this contract vehicle may or may not be the right tool for you. Jennifer Schaus is teaching a series of classes, as you can see here, and all classes are listed on our website under the events section with the registration link. And please note that the next one is tomorrow, June 10th at 12 p.m. Okay, and now a little bit about us. We work with U.S. federal government contractors, including product, service, and software firms. Our services range from market analysis reports to contract vehicles and compliance, and more information can be found on our website. Additionally, we have opportunities for your organization to advertise in our newsletter. We now reach over 23,000 subscribers, and this includes both contractors and government. Contact us for pricing information with the email shown on your screen. I also wanted to inform you of a new series that we're holding this year. We have launched a monthly series called the GovCon Live Q&A Cafe. This is a live webinar series held each month, and these will take place on the second Friday of each month this year in 2021 at 12 p.m. Eastern. We have assembled a group of 4 panelists who are subject matter experts on a specific federal contracting topic. The panelists will make a short presentation about the topics listed here on your screen, and then take your live questions about that topic. So, for example, our panelists covered subcontracting last month, and this Friday, on June 11th, our panelists will be covering sales and capture. Our panelists include attorneys, consultants, and other industry professionals, and you can sign up on our website under the Q&A Cafe tab. Sponsorships are available please email hello@jennifershops.com for a media kit with pricing details. Also, please note that you can use code DFARS for a $15 discount on each of these webinars. Okay, and now to introduce our speaker, David Dempsey. Welcome, David. We are glad to have you here with us today, and I'll now turn the floor over to you.
Okay, thank you, Hunter. And thank you, everyone, for attending today. I'd like to say a few other words about what Hunter just went through. The PSAC, for example, does a lot of excellent presentations on quite a few subject matters, and I've been doing one on cybersecurity and CMMC for about 3 years now. Next one coming up on June 24th, which is about 2.5 hours, and I give that with a subject matter expert so that the lawyers don't bore you to death on a subject that there's not much for lawyers to do. And then I was on the CMMC panel that was in January that Hunter just mentioned. My background is pretty straightforward. I've been doing government contracts for 43 years, and that's about it. What's related to government contracts, which would be intellectual property and export controls and things like that. So if I sound particularly boring today, at least you'll know why. 43 years of this stuff will wear anybody out. But now we're getting into a subject, foreign acquisition, DFARS Part 225, which the first page, I think, Hunter, we can go right to the first substantive page. And one more, please. And this is what I'll be speaking about. The first thing I want to point out here is that the guidance that the contracting officer uses, as Hunter pointed out, that's what the DFAR is for defense procurement personnel, is peculiar here in foreign acquisition because it's also guidance for contractor sourcing. There is an ability to look through this set of regulations and in effect pick which country you may want to explore for subcontracting in two ways. One, subcontract to them because they may have a major U.S. government contract or a defense contract, or use them in your supply chain for various purposes that you may have. Now, the foreign acquisition part, 225, basically covers 5 areas: Buy American Act, Trade Agreements Act, Foreign Military Sales, and I'll get to the other 2 on the next page. But first thing to understand about the Buy American Act is it's been pretty much eviscerated by the Defense Department, and in my opinion, much of the federal agencies themselves, except for the Department of Transportation agencies, who have a different Buy American approach. What you see here in this slide is they have cost of components, place of manufacturers for domestic end products and domestic construction material, defined terms, etc. And then we have this participating countries. I always like to bring up participating countries and qualifying / eligible countries under the Trade Agreements Act, because those were terms that I came up with back in 1979, 1980, when I was drafting the regs that implemented these the NATO MOUs for DoD. Getting back to the notion of the evisceration, as a practical matter, when the best value focus came in the late 90s, it became pretty clear that Buy American, which was a function of cost. And if there, we had the 6 and 12, and now under the Trump executive order, we have the 15 and 30% evaluation factors added to it. But if it's a best value procurement, price doesn't mean too much, if anything. So you should keep that in mind when you're looking for foreign sources. If the bulk of your work is best value contract, because the Buy American may not affect you that much. However, the Trade Agreements Act, which focuses on substantial transformation, various trade agreements between several countries, most notable now being the USMCA with Canada and Mexico, and that being revised. And it also has dollar thresholds. So, for example, even though the World Trade Organization's dollar figure is essentially $182,000 for supply items, that means that the Trade Agreements Act is going to apply if the estimated cost or value of the procurement is over $182,000. And if it's not, then the Buy American Act applies. Those are the two thresholds I'll discuss today. But another element is Israeli Free Trade Agreement, for example, is at 50,000. So anything that's 50,000 or more, Israel can, a supplier from Israel or a manufacturer in Israel who's selling something to the U.S. is essentially going to have a open shot at selling its products without any particular penalties, evaluation penalties associated with the evaluation of their offer at the government level. So those are the two principal statutes that make a difference nowadays. Now, if you're ever wondering what substantial transformation means, it's a defined term in the DFAR and the FAR, and it essentially says changed from something recognizable to something else that's recognizable. That's the source to find out if your particular product, and is particularly relevant to software, is CBP, which is Customs and Border Patrol, or Customs. They have an entire set of decisions related to substantial transformation in government contracts, and that's what the issue is something substantially transformed in an eligible country or a participating country, because when you have those two combined, you have a qualifying country. And those countries, again, like I said, are is a good way to start for expanding the supplier chain or the supply chain for your particular company, regardless of what it is. Foreign military sales was relatively new to the DFAR Part 225. It actually came in around 1980, but it didn't have much substance to it, and still doesn't, relatively speaking, because the Defense Security Cooperation Agency is the one who is responsible for foreign military sales, whether it's a FMS sale on direct or commercial. Direct is purchasing from the U.S. government, and commercial is purchasing from a commercial company. Most buyers and of course sellers would prefer to do it directly between the manufacturer and the purchaser. Poland, for example, would rather buy from Lockheed than the Air Force. And then foreign military funding characterizes the foreign military sales market. And then congressional oversight is a big part of foreign military sales. It's covered by the DCAA than it is more in the DFARS. When we get to the next slide, I mentioned 5 elements And in the next slide, or the last two that I was speaking of, if you could get to the next slide, Hunter. There we go. We have Appropriation Act restrictions. And those are principally the Berry Amendment, which is restrictions on food, clothing, particularly clothing, and items made out of fabrics. This is a significant sore spot, in my estimation, between European countries and the U.S. Defense Department. And then there's specialty metals, which is also a defined term within a rather lengthy clause, but it has an exception for those countries that we have some kind of defense agreement with, the NATO MOU being the most common. So that would mean Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, etc. Greece would have an exception under the specialty metals, or at least I think probably more I could say a good chance at an exception, where they don't have any chance for exception under the Berry Amendment for clothing, etc. But it also includes Czechoslovakia, Australia, Japan, Poland, other countries you don't necessarily associate with NATO, even though Poland's part of NATO now. The newest element, the DFAR 225, is the export controls. The Export Administration Regulation, which has a 600 series from the Department of Commerce, and then the International Traffic in Arms Regulation, or the ITAR, which is Department of State, went through a major change between 2012 and roughly 2014, where several items that used to be on the U.S. munitions list, or USML, were recharacterized, and I'm putting this generally, as a year 600 series item, so that the item was controlled by the Export Administration Regulation versus the ITAR. And that made things a lot easier for the export. And what made it easier is you can have a much better idea, because the year is much more precise in the commodity control list of describing what is covered by the year, versus the ITAR, which may describe an item as military use, military article, military service, but in unfortunate general terms. And a U.S. company would say this is kind of insane, because this is really a commercial product, or I can sell this to everybody. But when I sell it outside the U.S., I got to get an export license for it, which means I have to be registered down at the State Department, et cetera, et cetera. So enough of the industry complaints occurred over the years to change that. So now there's this 600 series, and essentially a 600 series item is just an item with 6 in it in the ECCN, the Export Commodity Control Number, and the company will have some degree, or like I just said, companies have some degree of precision in what constitutes a 600 series item, and therefore under the export control of the Commerce Department, it can proceed accordingly. Whereas it didn't used to have that. Now to get in or out of that 600 series, again, I have to be general here, is this definition of specially designed, which was a definition that emanated from State Department at a time when they were essentially being directed to give up some control, and they had a hard time doing that. And the struggle they had is manifested in the definition and process of analyzing whether something was specially designed for defense service or as a defense article. It's a double negative analysis. I've been through it a couple of times now, or several times, to some degree or another. And it requires a lot of thought, and it requires pretty good understanding of the technology and or the mechanics and or the software involved in the product that someone is trying to get out of the ITAR and into the ear. And it's not always successful by any means, and when it's not, it's not. The consequences of making the wrong decision could be quite expensive. The maximum fine with State Department exceeds $1 million per violation, and it's not nearly that much by Commerce Department, but that's not the point. You don't go into exports with the fines in mind. You go into exports making sure you're in the correct export control regime. Now, I've noticed working with clients over the years that they tend to ignore the supplements, won't go past the DFAR itself. So I've taken a moment to take the list and starting on the next page, Hunter, with the Army FAR supplement. And I mention that, and the rest of these coming up, is because first, if it has an asterisk for this presentation, it means there's something in it on foreign acquisition or with respect to the PGI, DFARS PGI, something related to the DFARS procedures and guidance and information section. But with respect to the AFARS, there's a lot of information there. Army directives, regulations, technical bulletins, Department of Army memos, and these Department of Army pamphlets, of which there are 141 at the moment. At least there were this morning. One of them is named Army Acquisition Procedures. A couple of hundred pages, September 2018. So if you're dealing with the Army, you should have a copy of the pamphlet 70-3 by your side, just as much as you would the DFAR and FAR and whatever other peculiar regulations that may be attached to the contracting office and the contracting item that is a subject of your business or contract with the Army. And the same with the AFARS, which is the Air Force FAR supplement. It's subordinate, of course, to the DFARS, like all of these will be. But Air Force instructions are quite useful to be aware of, and there are lots of them. I mean, I would say hundreds. But the Air Force manuals start out with a sentence that says, following this manual is mandatory. So you, in a sense, have an idea where the contracting officer or the buyer or the inspector, contract administration personnel is going to be coming from with respect to anticipating how it's going to work with foreign sources. The asterisk again indicates that there's going to be coverage in these Air Force manuals and Air Force instructions on handling either foreign personnel, foreign software, foreign produced software, foreign produced items, other services, whether it's overseas or within the U.S. that the item is sent or the software is used. And And then we have the DFARS. This is Acquisition Regulation Supplement. And this is characterized by DITCO, which is its own little outfit that does a lot of purchasing, if not all the purchasing for DITCO, but it's normally where you're going to start. And they have their acquisition handbook. Unfortunately, it's fairly outdated, but it is what it is, and they'll have individual and specific memorandums, etc., instructing contracting officers to behave in a certain way on certain items, and right now most of that is focused on the cloud, and making sure that DISA and GSA work together well in establishing how the cloud is going to operate with the emphasis on cybersecurity. Now, on the next page, we have Defense Logistics Agency and their DLA directives, essentially PROC letters, and there's dozens of those all the time. And they are particularly useful in the Berry Amendment and to some extent specialty metals, mostly the Berry Amendment, because DLA has been designated as the initial, if not final, arbiter of whether or not something is covered by the Berry Amendment. So you should know that, and of course proceed accordingly. Now this next one here, the Navy Marine Corps Acquisition Regulation Supplement, is again has information related to foreign acquisition, but the supplement here is the only agency I've seen, and that includes all the federal agencies, all the civilian agencies, as well as these DoD agencies, where they made a specific statement on the CMMC or the cybersecurity clause, and that's why I put the site in there, which is they're saying that clause is a material requirement. You know, if something's a material requirement in the procurement world, there's some characteristics there that you have to pay attention to. One of which is you can not be paid, or you can be defaulted if you don't meet a material requirement. I haven't seen any cases on that where Navy or Marines have enforced that particular notion, and I don't think they would be successful right now if they did, because in my estimation, and I'm digressing here a bit into the CMMC world, but prior to November of this past year, where we now have this strange Never Never Land we're in with respect to submitting a score, but not necessarily having to be compliant with 7012. Prior to that, I believe it was in April of 2019, Ms. Long essentially waived the requirement for cybersecurity, except for the requirement to have a system security plan and a plan of action and milestones. Some people may argue with that, but I've got quite a bit of documentation to support that approach. And then we go to the SOFARS, which is the Special Ops FAR Acquisition Regulation Supplement. And what's peculiar there is SOFARS has a specific clause on foreign persons, which is essentially saying they do not want any foreign personnel working on their service or R&D contracts without them having some background information. What that clause does is just say, give us the name and status, immigration status, etc., of a particular individual who the contractor would like to have work on the on the contract, but because they're not U.S. citizens, this clause requires that disclosure. Now, before anybody gets upset about whether that is discriminatory or not, the immigration Title 8, which is immigration laws, has a specific provision that says if the government, in the interest of national security or contract performance, has a requirement regarding nationality, then that's okay. So I don't want anybody getting upset about that if they don't have to. Now, this last supplement, which is the transportation supplement, has nothing on foreign acquisition. So as a consequence, it's still there, but you wouldn't look at it for purposes of on how to handle foreign sources. Now, all these sub-FAR supplements come from the acquisition.gov webpage, which, although it's not nearly as good as the one that Hill Air Force Base has before the I guess the FAR Council, but Federal Acquisition people took it over, and they list all of the FAR supplements that each agency has. So that's a site I would use when you're going to looking at the regulatory scheme, when trying to understand your particular contract or putting a proposal together and that sort of stuff, so you can make sure that you've got it more or less up to date. I say more or less up to date because sometimes it's difficult to find a deviation that's in effect that the solicitation doesn't tell you about, even though it is in effect, and so you're deemed to know it. That doesn't happen too often, but it's happened to me twice in the last couple of years, and I've gotten a little bit upset about that. Now, a lot of you may have signed up for this today just to hear about the Trump executive order and the Biden executive order. In terms of spoiling everything and giving everybody a chance to leave right now if they want, the Biden executive order to me is essentially worthless because it hasn't been implemented. Trump, as many of you know, did a lot with executive orders. He had the Buy American and Hire American, and then he came up with the strengthening Buy American preferences for infrastructure projects. And then 13881, which is started on the next slide, the one I'll be discussing, came out in July of 2019. And I'm discussing this one because this one's been implemented. It took about 8 or 10 months, maybe longer, to have it, well, a whole lot longer. July 18th it came out in 2019, and January 19th is when the final rule was published. And this has, I would say, significantly changed the vocabulary in the Buy American clause. But again, we have to go back to what I mentioned early on, is it's essentially price, what the Buy American clause was doing. But now it's not. Now it's gone a little bit, in the quote unquote old days, you had the 50% test for the cost of components and made in the U.S. That was the only issue involved, and then those were normally the only two issues involved because the price issue didn't make any difference. So if a company said they produce something in the U.S., and we have GAO decisions and, like I was saying earlier, customs service decisions about what constitutes production in the U.S. Was it produced in the U.S. or was it produced in another country? Because if it's it's not produced in the U.S., then the Buy American test will eliminate that item as a practical matter fairly quickly before you even get into the cost of components test. And now what's happened is the new definitions from the Trump executive order, which appear in the FAR, and I've given you the Federal Register site where it appeared in January of this year, because that site will also give you an explanation to what the writers were thinking, and so you've got the explanation and the actual read in one 15-page block. So we have definitions of fastener, foreign iron and steel, quote unquote, predominantly of iron or steel or a combination of both, and a definition of steel. And they're part of the definition of domestic end product and domestic construction material. So I'm going to be focusing for the next few minutes on what's going to constitute a domestic end product. I'm not going into the domestic construction material under the assumption that most of the people, or a lot of people listening in, are not going to be involved in construction as much as they are in supplying products in one fashion or another for the U.S. government. And keep in mind now, this is a FAR clause, not DFAR only, but because it's the newest thing and because it applies to the Defense Department, I feel constrained to discuss it. So we've got two kinds of domestic product now, or domestic end products. One is one that does not consist predominantly of iron or steel or a combination of both. And if that's what it is, then a domestic end product is going to be an unmanufactured end product mined or produced in the U.S. as the way the prior executive order and a clause had read. And then an end product manufactured in the U.S., test A, if the cost of components exceeds 55% of the cost of all components. Prior test was 50%. So we didn't really jack up too much there. Whereas in the Federal Highway Administration, it will sometimes get up to 70%. Federal Highway, Federal Railway, and then the airports authorities have their own particular Buy American provisions, which are quite severe when compared to the FAR. And you should know that they're completely unrelated. That is, the DOT has a completely different set of statutes to go by to reach their regulatory scheme than the rest of the government does with respect to its regulatory scheme under Buy American. And that's all we're talking about now is Buy American. And then the other definition of a domestic end product is going to be the end product is a COTS item and it's manufactured in the U.S. And there is no 55% test. So now we go to, on the next slide, we go to the domestic end product where it consists predominantly of iron or steel. So first test, of course, is manufactured in the U.S. if the cost of foreign iron and steel is less than 5% of the cost of all the components. So we're getting confusing there, and then we get completely buffaloed when we find out that the cost of foreign iron or steel is based on a good faith estimate. Now, if I was a contracting officer, I'd want a heck of a good faith estimate out of someone. So I wouldn't wing it and say, looks like 4% to me, or something along those lines. It would have some documentation to show that you reached that conclusion of 4% or less than 5%. on a rational basis. And now we get into the COTS end products. That is, a COTS end product that's predominantly of iron or steel. You apply the 55% cost of components test, where you didn't do that if it was a COTS end product that was not predominantly of iron or steel. And the exception to that are COTS fasteners, and fasteners is now a defined term. Many of you probably have noticed, not just in this presentation, but in prior ones, that this concept of commercial off-the-shelf items is under serious review right now, because people have first made the error that a COTS item and a commercial item are the same thing, and of course they're not, because COTS is an unchanged item sold to the government. And then with the advent of commercial item determinations, that sort of weaned its way, or leaked its way in my mind, into what constitutes a COTS item also, but that's more on an individual contracting officer by contracting officer determination. Anyway, that's where we are now with the Trump executive order. And in my estimation, the explanation surrounding a domestic end product and a domestic construction material is similar. It's not exactly the same, but for a brief overview, it's going to be similar. I should also mention something. I talked about the countries that have a defense agreement with the U.S. and they are exempt from the Buy American Act, which includes construction materials. Most of those defense agreements, the NATO MOUs, for example, specifically exclude construction material. So don't think that because a country is a NATO country, then they automatically have construction material waived as being subject to the Buy American Act. They don't. And now, under the executive order, they're going to be going through this test depending on the presence or absence of predominantly of iron or steel, which, when you think about it, reflects Trump's background in the construction business and reflects the greater scrutiny provided by the Department of Transportation for iron and steel products. So the problem with this definition is, and I'm certain it's going to be the case because it's the way it is in the Department of Transportation business, is subcontractors and lower tier subcontractors, because the clause is slowed down, and they got to ask themselves, why are you doing this to us when we've got a 55% cost of components leeway, i.e. 45% does not have to be exactly U.S. components, still made in the U.S., but it's still not all of U.S. components. Or if there's a steel item, same thing. Then we have the COTS fastener issue, but we've got companies all the way down the supply chain scratching their head, assuming they've even looked at the contract to see the clause, scratching their head on whether they qualify, and the prime, which may just be a general contractor in the construction business or an integrator, says, I don't care, but if everybody meets the clause, then I know I'll meet the clause. So I think you should prepare to be a bit flummoxed by the attitude of the primes and figure out a way that you can get past their objection, so that you can get your piece in there as a component that doesn't necessarily meet the end product, because all this is end product tests. So a sub or lower tier sub is going to be providing a component and try to get the prime to take the responsibility to do that calculation associated with the 45% of components, total cost of components that after being made in the U.S. are still eligible to be considered domestic end product. And now I've got the Biden executive order just for comparison purposes. It hasn't been implemented, and I don't know when it will be. I don't even know if there's a FAR case on it yet. But what it does is very similar to the Trump executive order. And I say that because of this last bullet here. FAR Council has essentially made that determination. There was a FAR case on reconsideration of the Trump executive order FAR case, and their conclusion was no FAR revisions needed. And that makes sense from a procurement policy perspective, because the one thing that the Biden executive order does is add this Made in America director and OMB to handle waivers. Or put another way, it's taken the waiver out of the control of the FAR Council for purposes of a procurement regulation and put it into the administration by the OMB for all the agencies, and they'll have their own little pathways to do that. So that concludes my presentation today. If you have any questions, there is the phone number, my email address, and you'll have to probably leave a message with the phone, but I'll get back to you and we can discuss whatever question you may have. So again, thank you for attending, and Hunter, thank you for emceeing this afternoon. Look forward to hearing from some of you all on the next talk with PSAC in a couple of weeks. Okay, take care. I'm done, Hunter.
Thank you so much, David. And thank you for a great presentation and sharing your time with us today. And thank you to everyone who joined us for this webinar. The recording will be on our website and YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. And please join us next week as we cover more parts of the DFARS.
Okay. Take care, everyone.